The following is a portion of an article that appeared in the New York Times on August 12, 1979, referring to an atomic bomb test carried out back in 1953 and is based on reporting by Wendell Rawls Jr. and A.O. Sulzberger Jr. and was written by Mr. Sulzberger. Washington, the atomic bomb was detonated at exactly 4:30 a.m., April 25, 1953, just as the 300-foot steel skeletal tower it topped was becoming visible in the pre-dawn darkness. It was a big blast, almost twice as powerful as any previously tested on American shores, and the shock waves that spread from the barren, lonely Yucca Flat site of the Nevada atomic testing grounds that chilly morning carried more than fallout. That shot, codenamed Simon, carried more trouble than any other in a series of 11 atomic bomb tests 26 years ago, according to newly declassified civilian and military documents, as well as interviews with some of the personnel involved. It dusted the nearby mesas and rangeland with enough radiation to force the government to throw up roadblocks and decontamination centers in a hasty, unplanned effort to minimize the damage. There was more to the story, but nowhere in the entire article or in the declassified documents was the story of a clandestine experiment carried out by a small group of individuals looking to enrich themselves, and one U.S. Army soldier who was present for that blast. Michael Bliss never knew his father, and his mother died when he was 15. So for the last 3 years, Michael lived with his grandmother in Cincinnati, Ohio. Michael was a handsome young man with an athletic build, and at 6 feet 5 inches tall, he stood out in any crowd. In high school, Michael's good looks and friendly nature made him many friends, as well as many female admirers. After graduating from high school, Michael felt a little lost. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He only knew that he wanted to get away from Cincinnati for a while. On October 14, 1945, 3 days after his 18th birthday, Michael Bliss enlisted in the U.S. Army. Because of his size, when Michael finished basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, he received orders to go to Fort McClellan, Alabama, for military police training. Michael spent 4.5 months at Fort McClellan, and on March 14, 1946, he completed his military police training and was assigned to the Provost Marshal's office at Fort Bragg, in North Carolina. Over the next 7 years, Michael served at 3 different bases and had reached the rank of Staff Sergeant before being assigned to Camp Desert Rock in Mercury Valley, Nevada, in February 1953. On January 3, 1953, 5 men were attending a secret meeting in the basement of a soon-to-be-retired Army officers' barracks near Las Vegas, Nevada. In attendance at the meeting were Brigadier General Horace Martin, Vice Commander of Atomic Weapons Research, Dr. Robert Baker, a major in the Army and the lead medical officer in charge of the Atomic Weapons Test Site, Matthew Collins, Assistant Director of the CIA, responsible for gathering intelligence on Soviet weapons, Dr. Werner Schmidt, a former Nazi scientist, brought over from Germany after the war to do medical research on the effects of atomic fallout on health. The last member of the group was Dr. Jonas Bradshaw, a biochemist for a large pharmaceutical company. Dr. Bradshaw was researching possible treatments for radiation poisoning, and his company was supplying the financial backing for their project. Assistant Director Collins called the meeting to discuss their secret project, codenamed REORP, an acronym for Reduce Effects of Radiation Poisoning. REORP was created by Dr. Baker, Dr. Schmidt, and Dr. Bradshaw. The 3 men were trying to develop a cure for radiation poisoning. They believed that combinations of specific chemicals introduced into a body shortly after radiation exposure could reverse the effects of radiation poisoning. The 3 men followed different tracks and came up with 3 solutions, believing that at least one would work. Major Baker was certain that the Pentagon would not allow them to do human testing of their solutions, but he felt it was necessary to push ahead anyway. Major Baker knew he would need help to pull this off, so he contacted his friend, A.D. Collins, and told him about their secret project. Major Baker convinced A.D. Collins that not only could their project save lives, but it would also be very lucrative for those involved. A.D. Collins brought General Martin into the project because they would need someone inside the Pentagon to help carry out their plan. Assistant Director Collins ran the meeting. "Where do we stand with the development of the chemical solutions?" Collins asked. "We've got 3 solutions, K-47, H-42, and N-68. Y0O. You will find these chemical compounds described in the documents in front of you. All 3 showed promise when tested on lab rats, and we believe that at least one of them will work and possibly all three, Major Baker said. We have color-coded the three solutions for easy identification. Solution K, 47 is red, H, 42 is blue, and N, 68 is green. We are ready for the A-bomb test on April 25th. General, have you identified your test subjects yet? Collins asked. I got their files right here, General Martin replied. Private First Class Douglas Talley. Height 6 feet. Weight 185 pounds. PFC Talley has no living family and currently has no girlfriend. Talley passed the physical training test we arranged last month. Private Andrew Steinhauer. Height 5 feet 11 inches. Weight 175. PVT Steinhauer has no living family and no girlfriend. PVT Steinhauer passed his PT test. Private First Class William Locke. Height 6 feet 1 inch. Weight 182. PFC Locke has no family, no girlfriend. PFC Locke passed his PT test. Staff Sergeant Michael Bliss. Height 6 feet 5 inches, weight 210. Sergeant Bliss has no family, no girlfriend. SFC Bliss passed his PT test. Since we have only 3 solutions to test, why do we have 4 subjects, and why use a staff sergeant as one of the subjects? Collins asked. 3 of the test subjects will each be treated with one of the solutions. 1 will get red, 1 blue, and 1 green. The 4th subject will not be treated and will act as a control. We chose Sergeant Bliss, so there will be someone in authority to make sure the other 3 do what we want them to do, Major Baker said. What happens to the 1 subject that doesn't get treated? He will probably die after several weeks, Major Baker said. How do you plan to cover that up? He will have an accident in the desert and his vehicle will catch fire. That's pretty cold-blooded, isn't it? AD Collins asked. Can't be helped. We have to have a control subject. How will this work? Collins asked. We will have a tent set up in area 2.25 miles from the test site. We have determined that the fallout in that particular spot will be high enough to expose soldiers to the right amount of radiation for the purposes of our test. The tent will contain everything we need to treat the 3 subjects with the red, blue, and green solutions. 2 hours before the A-bomb test, our 4 subjects will drive out to the tent in a truck with a generator and some electronic equipment labeled scientific equipment on board. Sergeant Bliss will have orders to start the generator and turn on the electronic equipment 1 hour before detonation. Once the equipment is running, the 4 men are to stand guard until relieved. The fallout from the bomb test will produce enough radiation to cause a mild case of radiation poisoning that we will treat immediately after the exposure. What scientific equipment will be on the truck? General Martin said. Just an old oscilloscope and a power supply to make the scope display a wavy line so that it will look like the equipment is doing something, Major Baker said. I hope you all realize that if this turns to shit, all of our bums will be on the line. So what happens if any of these men die? Das zwei VE picked min mit no Familien, Dr. Schmidt said. Wir haben Contingencies. AD Collins didn't like the idea of having a former Nazi on the team, but he knew that Dr. Schmidt was a brilliant scientist, so they were stuck with him. AD Collins looked around the room and said, I guess we are ready. We will have no more meetings before the April test. Just don't screw this up. April 25th, 1953. Early that Saturday morning, 25-year-old Sergeant Michael Bliss, along with PVT Steinhauer, PFC Locke, and PFC Talley, loaded a generator and 2 pieces of electronic equipment onto a 2.5-ton truck and headed out into the desert. Their destination was a supply tent set up about 2.25 miles from the atomic test site in Yucca Flat. Their orders were to park next to the supply tent, then, at 3:30, start the generator and turn on the electronic equipment. With the equipment running, they were to stand guard around the truck and the supply tent and wait for the detonation at 4:30. This morning's detonation would be the second bomb test the 4 soldiers would experience. On March 17th, the 4 of them sat in a trench 2 miles from the blast with 1,000 other soldiers for an A-bomb test. This time they would be above ground during the test. Only 3 people at the test site and a couple more back in Washington knew that Sergeant Bliss and his men were placed intentionally in a position where they would be exposed to a small amount of fallout from the bomb. They wanted to expose their subjects to enough radiation to cause a mild case of radiation poisoning. Then they would treat 3 of the soldiers with the chemical solutions they developed. PVT Steinhauer would not receive any of the treatments so that they could compare his progress with that of the other three. They hoped that they could find a cure for mild cases of radiation poisoning. If their plan worked, they would rerun the test against higher doses of radiation. If they were successful again, they would patent their treatment and make a great deal of money for the pharmaceutical company, providing financial support for their test and enrich themselves in the process. As instructed, Sergeant Bliss fired up the generator and turned on the 2 electronic boxes. By 4 o'clock, everything was working. He didn't know what the electronic boxes were supposed to do, but they appeared to be working the way he was told they should. At 4:25, Sergeant Bliss told his men to go inside the tent until after the detonation. When the men entered the supply tent, they were surprised to find 4 cots along one side of the tent, and on the other side were shelves with medical supplies. There were 3 large glass flasks on one of the shelves, the type you would see in a science lab, each filled with a different color liquid and sealed with a glass stopper. The liquids in the flasks were red, blue, and green. On a table near the shelves, there were 3 large syringes with long hypodermic needles. Sergeant Bliss thought the tent looked more like a small emergency mobile medical center than a supply tent. After studying the contents of the tent, Sergeant Bliss closed the flaps and checked his watch. It's 4:27. It is 3 minutes to 0 hour. Turn away from the blast and close your eyes until I tell you to open your eyes, Sergeant Bliss told his men. Just after 4:29, a gust of wind blew the tent flaps open, and before Sergeant Bliss could pull the flaps back in place, there was a flash of light so bright that it disoriented the 4 men, followed by the ear-splitting sound of the explosion. In seconds, they felt the heat from the blast. The shock wave from the blast threw PFC lock against the shelves, causing the flasks with the red, blue, and green liquids to fall. All 3 flasks broke and spilled their contents on the floor. The liquids mixing on the floor caused a chemical reaction, which produced a dense cloud of yellow gas inside the tent. Sergeant Bliss told his men to get out of the tent, and in his haste to escape the fumes, Sergeant Bliss slipped and fell in the slimy mixture of chemicals and broken glass. Major Baker and his team were unaware that there had been a shift in wind direction, increasing the amount of fallout in the area of the truck and the supply tent. When the 3 doctors, wearing protective gear, checked on their test subjects, they found PFC lock, PCF tally, and PVT Steinhauer lying on the ground outside the tent gasping for air. When asked where Sergeant Bliss was, PCF tally pointed to the tent. They found Sergeant Bliss lying in the middle of a gas-emitting puddle of chemicals and broken glass. In a panic, Major Baker told Tally, Locke, and Steinhauer to get Sergeant Bliss and get on the truck. Major Baker drove the truck while Doctors Bradshaw and Schmidt followed in their Jeep. 2 weeks later, Major Baker, Dr. Schmidt, and Dr. Bradshaw were huddled outside a room in a deserted wing of the base hospital discussing the terrible situation in which they found themselves. Reorp had no authorization by the Pentagon to perform their test, and it had become a complete disaster. Tally, Locke, and Steinhauer had already died from radiation poisoning, and their bodies were on ice in the hospital morgue, while Sergeant Bliss lay in the room behind them in a coma. Like the others, Sergeant Bliss was exposed to lethal radiation levels, but he was also exposed to the mixture of chemicals on the tent floor and the gas they produced. Dr. Schmidt had spent 2 hours removing broken glass from the sergeant's back when they first brought him into the hospital. If anyone found out that those 4 men had intentionally been exposed to a fatal dose of radiation, there would be hell to pay. "I don't understand how he could still be alive," said Major Robert Baker. "The exposure to that much radiation should have been enough to kill him like it did the others. And the sergeant was exposed to the mixture of our chemicals and the gases they emitted." Dr. Schmidt, the German scientist, said, "No one can know that we have done. When he dies, we must make the sergeants disappear MIT to others." Dr. Schmidt is right. If anyone comes asking why we are hiding a dying man back here, we're sunk. We will have to dispose of his body along with the others before anyone finds him here, Dr. Bradshaw said. "I think VE should make sure that the sergeant is not discovered," said Dr. Schmidt. "I think VE should speed things along." No, we can't be thinking like that. In this country, we don't do things the way you did in your country during the war. We will not add to our crime by speeding up his death. We have to find another way, Major Baker said. "He will probably be gone in a couple of days anyway, so we will wait." We will decide what to do then." Unknown to the three men, Sergeant Bliss had wakened and heard their conversation. They said he should be near death from exposure to the radiation and the chemicals, but he didn't feel sick or even injured. Sergeant Bliss heard as much as he could stand and rushed into the hallway to confront the doctors. "I ain't dying, and you a-holes ain't gonna kill me. So how you gonna make it worth it for me to keep my mouth shut?" Sergeant Bliss yelled at the doctors. The three men just stared at Sergeant Bliss in disbelief. Major Baker arranged to have Sergeant Bliss move to a more comfortable room, with a sign on the door saying "Quarantine, authorized personnel only." For the next 3 weeks, the three doctors, one general at the Pentagon, an assistant director at CIA, and their financial backers worked to find a plan that would protect them and keep Sergeant Bliss happy and quiet. When they finally arrived at the solution they believed would work, the conspirators negotiated with Sergeant Bliss. It took them 3 days to hammer out a proposal that Sergeant Bliss agreed to sign. The main points of the agreement were that Sergeant Bliss would have to disappear. His name would be changed, and he would be moved to someplace where no one knew him. He had to agree never to tell anyone what happened at Yucca Flat, and also, Sergeant Bliss had to agree to meet with the doctors once every 6 months for a complete medical checkup. For his cooperation, an annuity would be set up for Sergeant Bliss that would pay him $3,000 each month for as long as he lived for agreeing to their conditions. The money would come from the pharmaceutical company and the CIA. Sergeant Bliss was happy to sign the agreement. $36,000 a year was a lot of money for someone his age. He saw himself living the good life for many years. On the other hand, the doctors and their backers never expected him to live more than 3 or 4 years. They anticipated that Sergeant Bliss would develop one or more cancers that would eventually cause his demise. They were just happy that they could continue to study the changes in the sergeant's health until the end of his life. A week after Michael signed the agreement, General Martin and Major Baker came to see Michael. "Sergeant, we have had a bit of luck. A wounded soldier sent back from Korea passed away yesterday. He was a close match for your description, so we have swapped your identities," General Martin said. "So, First Lieutenant Jackson Winslow will become Sergeant Michael Bliss, and you will become Lieutenant Jackson Winslow. So, I'll still be in the Army, but now as an officer?" Michael said. "No, you will receive a medical discharge with a disability. You will have a military ID that will allow access to any VA hospital, if needed." The following week, when Dr. Baker came to get Michael, the doctor found him looking at himself in a mirror and saying over and over, "Hi, I'm Jackson Winslow." Before he said anything to Michael, Dr. Baker handed Michael an accident report from the provost's office at Camp Desert Rock. The statement read, "On the morning of May 12, 1953, a truck carrying 4 soldiers went off the road and down an embankment and caught fire. The 4 occupants perished in the fire." The report went on to list the 4 dead soldiers. The first name on the list was Sergeant Michael Bliss. The next 3 names were Locke, Talley, and Steinhauer. Neither Dr. Baker nor Michael commented on the report. Dr. Baker handed Michael a large envelope and said, "Here are your medical disability and discharge papers. It's time to go, Sergeant. Shouldn't you be calling me Lieutenant Winslow now?" Dr. Baker looked at Michael like he was some kind of bug under his microscope. "With me, you will always be addressed as Sergeant." "So, where is my new home going to be?" Michael asked. June 1953. Jackson Winslow arrived in Brodericksburg, Pennsylvania, in June 1953 and rented a house on the corner of Quaker Street and William Penn Road. After settling into his new home, he went to the First Bank of Brodericksburg and opened checking and savings accounts and began depositing half of each annuity check into the savings account and the rest in his checking account. Michael was determined not to waste money because he didn't trust the people he made his deal with. At 6 feet 5 inches tall and 210 pounds, the 25-year-old was hard to miss as he moved about town. He seemed a likable sort and quickly made several friends around town. Jackson liked Brodericksburg, but found that he didn't enjoy living in an apartment and decided that he would like to have a house with some land. Jackson started looking for real estate for sale on the outskirts of Brodericksburg. After 2 weeks of looking at real estate ads, he found a property that interested him. The listing was for a 13-room farmhouse with 25 acres of land and a barn. The ad referred to the farm as the Old Cobain Place. The ad also said that the house was empty and priced for a quick sale. Jackson contacted the real estate agent that listed the property and asked to see the place that afternoon. As they toured the property, the agent told Jackson that the house was over 100 years old and had been in the Cobain family for all of that time. The last members of the Cobain family moved away in 1947, leaving the house unoccupied. 2 weeks earlier, the agent got the family's go-ahead to sell the farm. The house was structurally sound but needed a lot of work to take care of all of the required repairs. The work didn't put Jackson off, as he had nothing else to do with his time. He was interested in the place, and the price of $12,000 meant he could afford it. He told the agent that he was interested in the farm, but he wanted to think about it overnight. When he got back to town, Jackson went to the library and asked the librarian if she could help him. When the librarian looked up, Jackson was stunned by her beauty. She was a blue-eyed blonde, and she took his breath away. The librarian smiled at him and said, "I'm Margot Kurtz, and you're Jackson Winslow, aren't you?" Jackson stammered a little as he asked, "How do you know me?" "Everyone in town knows who you are, or at least all of the girls do," Margot said. Jackson could feel his face flush and tried to cover it up by asking Margot if she knew any possible resource that would give him historical information about the old Cobain place. When Margot stood up to assist him, he got his second shock. Margot was not only beautiful, but she was also very tall, at least 6 feet tall. Margot told Jackson to follow her and led him to the library's reference room, where she pointed to several volumes listed as histories of Brodericksburg. "You should be able to find what you need here," Margot said. "If you need any assistance, please let me know." She gave Jackson a big smile as she left the room. Jackson spent 3 hours digging through the books before he found what he wanted. He had discovered an article written for the Brodericksburg Times in 1925. The article told the story of the old Cobain farm. The Brodericksburg Times, March 16, 1925. In 1847, Quimby Cobain built a farmhouse on 25 acres of land adjacent to Wismer Road, 1 mile south of Brodericksburg. The bricks for the large 13-room house were made from clay dug on his property and fired in a kiln built by Quimby. The farmhouse sits on a hill overlooking a large farm pond to the north and Wismer Road to the west. Besides the house, there is a dairy barn on the east side of the house. The barn cellar has stanchions for 15 milk cows, while on the main floor, there are stalls for plow and carriage horses. The third level of the barn is a loft for storing hay and grain to feed the animals. The only access to the farm is via a dirt lane, which runs 200 yards from Wismer Road up to the house. It is believed that the reason for the location of the farm was Cobain's need for privacy. Many people in Brodericksburg knew that Quimby Cobain was an abolitionist and that the Cobain farm was part of the Underground Railroad, helping runaway slaves escape into New York and then on to Canada. It is believed that as many as 800 men, women, and children took refuge on his farm during their long trek north. On October 1857, 4 officials from Virginia, really just bounty hunters, came to Brodericksburg looking for a group of runaway slaves they had been tracking. The men carried a letter from Henry Wise, the governor of Virginia, requesting local law enforcement's assistance in searching for the runaways. They received no help from the Brodericksburg police, so the 4 bounty hunters went out on their own and began visiting local farms looking for the freedom seekers. The last time the 4 men were seen was on Saturday, October 31st. The rumors around town were that the bounty hunters were not seen after going to the Cobain farm, but when the local authorities investigated, they found no sign of the missing men. Rumors started that Quimby Cobain killed the 4 men and buried them somewhere on the farm. Although the family denied the story, rumors persisted, and later someone claimed that the dead bounty hunters haunted the house. After Quimby died in 1878, his 3 sons took over the farm and lived there with their families. After reading the article, Jackson became obsessed with owning the Cobain farm. As he was leaving the library, Margot came out from behind her desk and asked him if he found the information he needed. "Yes, I did, thank you. You were very helpful." Margot flashed her smile again and said, "I'm glad I could help. I hope we see you again." Jackson smiled at Margot and said, "I intend to make a point of seeing you again." This time it was Margot that blushed. The next morning, Jackson called the real estate agent and offered $10,500 for the farm. He had to wait 3 days to get the answer he wanted, and on August 15th, Jackson took ownership of the old Cobain farm. That night, Jackson dropped into a local bar he frequented to have a beer. As he stood talking to the bartender, he felt a hand on his arm, and when he turned to see who it was, he found Margot standing next to him. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," Margot said. "I am certainly glad to see you again," Jackson said. "Can I ask why you were interested in the history of the old Cobain place?" "I was thinking of buying the farm and wanted to know its story." "So did you buy it?" "Yes, as of today, it belongs to me." "Really? Kids at school used to say that the house is haunted. You don't believe that, do you?" "No, I don't believe in ghosts," Margot said. "That's good because I wouldn't want my new girlfriend to be afraid of ghosts." "New girlfriend? Huh? Aren't you getting a little ahead of yourself? I haven't even agreed to go out with you yet." "Well then, would you have dinner with me tomorrow night?" "Can I think about that for a while?" "Sure, you can have 2 minutes." Margot looked at her watch and then tilted her head back and looked up at the ceiling. When she looked back at Jackson, she said, "Okay, yes, I'll have dinner with you if we can go dancing after." Their dinner was excellent, but for Margot, it was the dancing that she enjoyed the most. Being 6 feet tall made her taller than any other guy she had dated, and with Jackson, she could wear heels and still not be taller than he was. While they were dancing, Margot asked him what he did for a living. He didn't want to lie to her, so he stretched the truth a bit. "I don't work. I was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army and was involved in a serious accident that has left me with some permanent injuries. I am on disability, so the government sends me a check every month so that I don't have to work. I am doing a lot better than the doctors thought I ever would, but I still have to go to the VA hospital in Philadelphia once every 6 months for a checkup." It was as close to the truth as he dared get. After that first date, Margot and Jackson went out together at least twice a week or more. Jackson was putting in long days, working on the repairs that the old farmhouse required when he received a call from Dr. Baker in October. The doctor called to remind Jackson that he was due for his 6-month checkup. Dr. Baker directed him to report to the new REORP lab the 3 doctors had set up in Philadelphia the following day and planned to stay overnight. When Jackson arrived at the REORP lab, he passed through a large empty room and into a smaller room set up like a doctor's examination room. Dr. Baker, Dr. Bradshaw, and Dr. Schmidt were waiting for him there. While the doctors drew blood and took x-rays of his body, Jackson happily told the doctors about the farmhouse he was restoring and Margot, his new girlfriend. The doctors' reaction to his stories disappointed him. They showed no interest in his life, the life he was forced to live because of their screw-up. His dislike of the doctors increased that day. After 2 days of being poked and prodded, and his physical stress levels tested along with the time required for him to return to his regular pulse and heart rate, Major Baker told Jackson he could leave. As he was making his way out of the lab, the 3 doctors discussed their findings. "There is no change in the sergeant's vitals," Dr. Schmidt said.
Die Temperatur 98,5, Blutpressor 1,2075, Pulse 50.
"Did you notice the scars from the broken glass on his back? They are almost entirely gone. I've never seen scars recede so quickly," Dr. Bradshaw said. "I noticed that too. The sergeant looks healthier than he did before the accident," Dr. Baker said. "Do you know what this means?" The other 2 doctors smiled as they looked at Dr. Baker and waited for him to say more. The sergeant was inside the tent, lying on broken glass and the spilled chemical solutions, while the other men were outside the tent. They were all exposed to the same amount of radiation, but only the sergeant survived. "We may have accidentally created a miracle treatment for more than just radiation poisoning. We must try and recreate the mixture that the sergeant was exposed to and do another test." "Yeah, we must try." Jackson's relationship with Margot was becoming more serious, and he was beginning to think about marriage. They were spending most of their free time together, and on weekends, Margot often came out to the farmhouse to help him with his current project. After nearly 9 months, Jackson had finished the work in all of the rooms on the 2nd floor and only had 1 room left on the main floor. It was a small room off of the kitchen that he decided to turn into an office. One wall of the room had built-in cabinets and drawers from floor to ceiling. The built-ins were in poor condition, and he deemed them not salvageable. Jackson was in the process of tearing out the built-ins when he discovered a bundle of papers rolled up and tied with a piece of string in the wall behind the cabinets. The documents turned out to be the original architectural design drawings for the Cobain house and barn. Jackson studied the drawings and noticed a feature that appeared to indicate an underground tunnel connecting the house and barn. There was no mention of a tunnel in the article that Jackson read about the Cobain farm, and the real estate agent didn't mention it. Jackson wondered if anyone other than Quimby Cobain knew of its existence and if it was still there. With the drawings in hand, Jackson went down to the cellar with a flashlight and closely examined the east wall in the area indicated on the architectural drawing. In the dark cellar, even with the flashlight, he could find nothing to indicate the existence of a door or any other opening in the stone foundation. He studied the drawings again and saw an arrow pointing up between the floor joists where they sat on top of the foundation. Written next to the arrow were the words, "Latch Release." Jackson trained the flashlight between the floor joist above his head, and after a couple of minutes, he found it. The iron handle of the lever was almost below eye level behind the wall. Anyone shorter than him would not be able to see the handle. He pushed up on the lever until he heard a metallic clack, and a portion of the stone wall moved. A section of the wall 6 feet wide and 6 feet tall had pivoted slightly, causing the left side to move into the basement a few inches, while the right side retreated into the wall. Jackson pulled on the left side and turned the section of the wall till it opened to 90 degrees. He studied the tunnel entrance and found that it was built around an iron pole that acted as a single pivot point. With the entrance closed, it looked like the rest of the wall, and the stone joints fit so closely together that unless you knew exactly where the secret door was, you would never find it. If the farm was part of the Underground Railroad, Jackson guessed that Quimby Cobain used the tunnel to hide runaway slaves if anyone came looking for them. Jackson had to duck his head to get through the opening, but could stand once inside the tunnel. The tunnel air was cool and dry, but had the smell of a space that had been closed up for many years. He pointed the flashlight into the darkness, but he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of him. He moved to his right until he touched the tunnel wall, and then started feeling forward along the wall while counting each step he took. He counted 215 steps before he reached the far end of the tunnel. Finding the door on this end of the tunnel was much easier. There was an iron bar, about 6 inches long, sticking out of the wall, and when Jackson pulled down on the bar, the door pivoted open, the same as the cellar entrance. He opened the door wider and found himself staring into the lower level of the barn. After examining the door from inside the barn, Jackson noticed no way to open the door from inside the barn. Even with both entrances to the tunnel opened, it was still too dark for Jackson to see into the deepest part of the tunnel. He headed back to the house to get a work light and 2 long extension cords to bring more light into the tunnel. When he re-entered the tunnel with his work light, he got a better look at the tunnel's dimensions. The tunnel was about 12 feet wide with an arched ceiling. The tunnel center was about 8.5 feet high and just under 7 feet high along the walls. As he explored the tunnel, he made a gruesome discovery. Halfway through the tunnel along the left wall were the desiccated remains of 4 men. The bodies were still in the clothes they were wearing when they died. Jackson noted that 2 of the bodies had obvious bullet holes in their skulls, and there appeared to be what looked like bullet holes in the coats the other 2 men were wearing. Based on their attire, he believed that the 4 bodies belonged to the missing bounty hunters. If he was right, the bodies had been in the tunnel for over 90 years. Jackson was amazed that there was anything left of them other than bones, but these bodies appeared mummified. Jackson was debating what he should do with his discovery when he heard a voice, no more than a whisper, say, "Help us." The hair on the back of his neck bristled, and he could feel the goose flesh on his arms and legs. He looked around the tunnel, but he was still alone. Jackson had almost decided that the voice was just in his imagination when he heard it again. "Tell Governor Wise what happened to us." Jackson was scared and confused. From his research, he knew that Virginia Governor Henry Wise had given the 4 bounty hunters a letter of introduction, asking for local authorities in Pennsylvania to assist the bounty hunters in their hunt for the runaway slaves. Jackson wondered if he was really hearing the voices of the dead men in the tunnel, or if he was losing his mind. "Are you speaking to me?" Jackson asked, but got no response. Jackson closed the barnside entrance to the tunnel and left the tunnel at a dead run, closing the cellar's door behind him. He decided never to tell anyone about the tunnel or its contents and never go in there again. After that day, Jackson often felt a presence near him and would hear the whispers. He didn't know if all of the bounty hunters spoke to him or if it was just one of them. The voice always sounded the same. so Jackson decided it was only one of them. Over time, Jackson began to think of the voice only as the Virginian. He guessed that the spirit escaped from the tunnel while he had the doors opened. Deciding that the spirit or ghost or whatever it was didn't pose a threat to him, Jackson went back to work fixing up his house. With his study finished and the house in much better shape than it had been when he moved in, he thought the house would be a great place to raise a family. So, on March 6, 1954, Jackson Winslow proposed to Margot Kurtz, and she said yes. On Saturday, June 20, 1954, Jackson and Margot were married in a small ceremony attended by Margot's sister, Karen, and brother-in-law, Howard Bush. After the wedding, Jackson and Margot went back to the house to consummate their marriage. When Jackson met Margot, she was a virgin and insisted that she would remain one until she married. Their wedding night was going to be her first time. At home, Margot retreated to the bedroom to change, and Jackson got a bottle of champagne he bought that afternoon out of the refrigerator and poured a glass for each of them. When Margot reappeared, she was wearing a sexy pink nightgown. He felt himself becoming aroused as he offered Margot a glass of the champagne. Jackson made a toast to their love, then set the glasses aside and took her into his arms. He had never been as excited while kissing her as he was on their wedding night. Jackson had kissed her jugs, but this time was different because he knew that he was finally going to make love to Margot. They kissed and caressed each other while Jackson lifted Margot's nightgown over her head and dropped it on the floor. He picked her up and laid her on the bed. Jackson had never seen Margot in just her innerwear before, and he thought she was beautiful. He got undressed and joined Margot on the bed. While kissing her again, she wrapped her arms around him and held him so tight that he couldn't move for a couple of minutes. "Are you okay?" Jackson asked. "I'm good now," Margot said. When Margot relaxed her grip, Jackson began sex with her. He kissed Margot on the lips and neck and then whispered, "Does it feel good?" "Yes, it does. It feels fantastic," she said. "Tell me how it feels and talk dirty." "I love the way you're screwing me with your tool," she said. "You are making my kitty so hot. I feel like I'm going to explode." Later, Margot told Jackson that she couldn't believe that she had said those things, but liked how it made her feel using those words to describe how she felt. They made love 2 more times that night before they went to sleep, and did it again in the morning as soon as they woke up. After that, Margot couldn't get enough of Jackson. They were in love, hot for each other's bodies, and they made love almost every day for the next few months. Then, in October, Jackson got the call for his 6-month checkup in Philadelphia. He told Margot that he would take the train down on Friday and stay overnight, returning home late Saturday night, and he asked her to pick him up at the depot. As Jackson was standing in the kitchen waiting for Margot to take him to the train station to head off to his appointment at the VA hospital, the Virginian spoke to him. "You can't trust them." Without thinking, Jackson said out loud, "You're right about that." Margot, who was coming into the kitchen, asked, "Are you talking to me?" "No, I was just thinking out loud," he said, then thought, "I am going to have to be more careful about responding to the Virginian's comments when she's around." When Jackson returned home Tuesday night, Margot picked him up at the train station. When he got into the car, he noticed that Margot was sitting behind the wheel wearing just a warm coat and panties. "Where are the rest of your clothes?" "I just thought that I would give you something to think about on the ride home." "I am going to do more than think about it. I am going to get started right now." Jackson moved close to Margot and kissed her. "I'll give you 5 minutes to stop that, or I will slap your hand," she said, as she returned Jackson's kiss. "Just wait till I get you home. You're going to very busy slapping my hands," he said. Starting in 1956, Jackson began showing signs of paranoia. He believed that government agents were spying on him and meant to do him harm. He was losing interest in social life and began turning down Margot's requests to go dancing. When they did go out, he didn't like the way other men looked at her. Things got to the point that Jackson didn't want to leave the house unless he had to. For a time, Margot stayed home with HM, but she hated not having a social life. So she started going out with friends and ignored his pleas that she stay home. Nights when Jackson was home alone, which was happening more and more often, the Virginian would talk to him, and he found himself talking back, even though he knew the Virginian would not respond to anything he said. The Virginian's comments usually mirrored Jackson's fears and grievances. He wondered how the Virginian could understand him so well, but never responded to anything Jackson said to him. On October 26, 1959, Dr. Baker, who was now a colonel, called Jackson and told him to come to the reorp lab on Friday the 30th and planned to stay until Sunday afternoon. Jackson told Margot about his upcoming trip, and it was apparent to him that something was off. She didn't seem to care that he would be away over Halloween weekend. In the past, Margot would make Jackson go out dancing with her on Halloween and then go home and make love. It surprised Jackson that she didn't seem to care that he would miss Halloween. Jackson arrived at the reorp lab just after 2 o'clock on Friday. He was not looking forward to the medical examination he was about to receive. Jackson felt like a lab rat. The tests were always the same, and he hated all of them. He resented the treatment he received from the 3 doctors, and he hated that Nazi, Dr. Schmidt. Most of all, their attitude often made him want to bash their heads in, a desire that increased with each visit. Despite all of the tests performed on him, Jackson managed to hide his changing mental state. In their interviews with him, he never told the doctors about his fear that a secret government organization was watching his every move because he believed that the doctors could be a part of that organization. He also neglected to tell them about the Virginian who spoke to him when he was by himself. By 6 o'clock Saturday afternoon, Jackson had reached his limit with the tests and the doctors' attitudes. He addressed Colonel Baker and said, "I have had as much of this shit as I can handle, so I am going home." Jackson waited for the colonel to try to stop him, but Baker said, "That's fine. I believe we have what we need for now. We will see you in 6 months." After he left the lab, Colonel Baker wrote the following note in Jackson's file. No sign of radiation poisoning, no tumors or cancers, no blood diseases, and no changes in his overall physical condition. The most remarkable observance is the sergeant's appearance. The subject doesn't seem to have aged at all over the last 5 years. If anything, he appears to be healthier than he did before the event. Saturday, October 31st, 1959. On the trip back from Philadelphia, he thought about the way Margot usually picked him up at the Brodericksburg J&J rail station. He hoped that she would be there wearing something sexy. The sex was always unforgettable when he returned from one of his trips to the REORP lab. This time Jackson was disappointed to find that she wasn't at the station to pick him up, so he had to take a taxi home. He arrived home just after 11 p.m. The house was dark, and the car was parked in the driveway. Jackson assumed that Margot had been out earlier, but where and with whom? He couldn't understand why she wasn't at the station waiting for him, and why she didn't park the car in the barn when she got home. It angered him when she went off somewhere without him, and without telling him. She was probably in bed already, so Jackson decided against talking to her until morning. Instead of going straight up to bed, Jackson went to the liqueur cabinet and got his bottle of VO, and poured himself a double. He took the drink into his office and sat at his desk. As he took the first sip of the Canadian whiskey, he noticed an envelope with his name on it sitting on the desk. The envelope contained a note from Margot, along with her wedding and engagement rings. The message was brief and straight to the point. "I can't stand living like this anymore. I don't have any friends because of you, and for the last 2 years, I have felt like a prisoner in this house. You are a cold man, and I don't love you. I have met someone, and he loves me and has asked me to go away with him. I have a right to be happy, so by the time you read this note, I will be gone, and I am never coming back." The note was signed Margot. After reading the note, he just sat at his desk, trying to control his building rage. He picked up his glass of VO and studied its amber color as he thought about what he should do. Should he go looking for Margot, or just let her go? He felt that if he could get his hands on her, he would make her regret cheating him. Jackson was just about to sip his drink when he heard a noise somewhere in the house. He sat quietly for a minute and listened for another sound. The house was quiet until he heard the whisper, "She's here," it said. Jackson recognized the voice as the Virginian. After hearing the whispered alert, "She's here," Jackson realized that the noise he heard came from the second floor of the house. Jackson opened one of the desk drawers and retrieved his Army-issue Colt .45, and then with gun in hand, he kicked off his shoes and quietly climbed the back staircase to the second floor and approached the bedroom. He stood outside the door for a moment and listened. The Virginian spoke again. "You must punish her." Jackson pushed the bedroom door open, looked inside. The room was dark, and he could not see anything in the room. He stepped inside the room and turned on the overhead light. When he looked at the bed, He saw Margot and a man he didn't know, and both of them were naked. Jackson could see the fear in their eyes as they woke and saw him. Jackson could hear the fear in Margot's voice when she said, "Jackson? So, you thought you were just going to walk out on me with him?" He said, "Please, just let us go," she said. Jackson heard the voice again, "Kill them now." Jackson moved closer to Margot and said, "You are never leaving me." The shot from the .45 almost took the top of Margot's head off. The noise from the gun's discharge left his ears ringing while Margot's lover pushed himself back against the headboard, then put his hands in front of him. The man began begging for his life, but it did no good. Jackson shot the man twice in the chest, then stared at the mayhem he had caused. Jackson had forgotten how loud a .45 could be in a confined space, but knew the house was far enough away from his neighbors that no one would have heard the gunshots, and to support that thought, the Virginian said, "No one heard the shots when Quimby Cobain killed us. What do I do now?" Jackson asked out loud as the gravity of what he had done sank in. "What do I do now?" Jackson broke down and started to cry until the Virginian spoke to him. "You have to clean up the mess you made and hide the bodies. You know where to hide the bodies, don't you? You must bring them to us." Jackson looked around the bedroom to assess the damage and decide on a plan of action. The bodies of Margot and her lover would go into the tunnel, but what would he do with the blood-stained mattress, sheets, and pillowcases? He would have to find a way to dispose of them. Jackson went down to the cellar, opened the tunnel door, and set up his work light to see in the tunnel. He then went out to the barn to get a canvas tarp to cover the bodies so he could move them. When he entered the barn, he discovered a car parked where his car should have been. It was a 1956 Chevrolet station wagon. The car was another problem that Jackson would have to solve. The car would have to go before anyone came snooping around the farm. When he got back to the bedroom, he pulled the dead man's body off the bed and onto the trap, then rolled the body up in it. He dragged the body from the second floor down into the tunnel, dumped it from the tarp onto the ground, then pushed it against the wall near the remains of the 4 bounty hunters. On the way up to get Margot's body, he stopped in the office, picked up her rings, and put them in his pocket. Then, before wrapping Margot's body in a tarp, he slipped her rings on her finger. Holding Margot in his arms, Jackson said, "Margot, why did you do this to us? I never wanted to hurt you." After sitting with her for a few minutes, he picked Margot up and carried her down to the tunnel. Jackson was much gentler with Margot's body, placing her on the floor and folding her hands together on her chest. Before he closed the tunnel, he wrapped the pistol in oilcloth and put it in the tunnel. In the bedroom, Jackson picked up the dead man's clothes off the floor and removed a wallet and car keys from the pants. He looked in the wallet and found that the man's name was Jerry Adler, and he had an address in Brodericksburg. Jackson put the keys and the wallet in his pocket, then collected all of the bloody bed linens and stuffed them into one of the pillowcases in Adler's clothes. Next, he dragged the bloody mattress and the pillowcase filled with the stained bed linens down the front stairs and out the front door and left them in the front yard. He went back and moved the box spring off the bed frame and leaned it against the wall, examining it to make sure there were no blood stains. After that, he disassembled the metal bed frame, carried it downstairs and set it in the backyard, planning to use the hose to clean it later. He returned to the bedroom with a bucket of warm water with a household cleaner and scrubbed the walls and floor. The only thing left to do in the bedroom was patch 3 holes in the wall where the bullets had hit. Now, he had to make it appear that Margot had left him. He started by taking a suitcase from the closet and filling it with her underwear and stockings. Those would go with the mattress and bloody bed linens. Next, he filled a box with all of her shoes, and in another larger box, he put all of her clothes. All of these things went out to the front yard. With everything ready, Jackson went to the barn, got a 1-gallon glass jug, filled it with gasoline and put that in the back of Adler's car, and then pulled the car around to the front of the house. Jackson put Margot's shoes and clothes on the front seat, then put the mattress, the pillowcase, and the suitcase in the back. With the car loaded, Jackson headed south toward Philadelphia. His first stop was a wooded area that was being cleared of trees to build houses. Jackson had passed by this area several times and knew that there was an area where the workers had been burning piles of brush and trees. Jackson made sure there was no other traffic in the area before pulling into the site. He backed the car up to a small pile of brush that had not completely burned. Jackson removed the mattress from the car and put it on top of the brush pile, and then tossed the pillowcase with the bed linens and Adler's clothes on the stack. Next, he opened the suitcase with Margot's underwear and put it on the pile. Jackson doused the mattress, pillowcase, and contents of the suitcase with gasoline, then poured a trail of the fuel from the mattress over to the left side of the car. Jackson tossed the empty glass jug into the brush pile, then got in the car and started the engine. Jackson pulled a pack of matches out of his pocket. He lit a match and dropped it, but it went out before it reached the ground. He lit and dropped another match, and this time he was on target. As soon as the flames started toward the brush pile, he accelerated out of the lot. He had only gone about 10 yards before the whole brush pile ignited. Jackson did not hang around to see if everything burned. Jackson continued to Philadelphia, arriving there just after 5 a.m. Jackson found an open diner and stopped for breakfast. After eating, he drove to the loading dock at a Salvation Army donation center. Jackson unloaded the boxes with Margot's shoes and clothes, left them by the door, and drove away. Jackson parked the car 2 blocks from a rail station with northbound service, then wiped the steering wheel, the door handles, and any other surfaces he touched. Then, leaving the keys in the ignition, he walked to the station. At 9 a.m., he was headed back to Brodericksburg. When he got home, he washed the bed frame with Mr. Clean and rinsed it off with the hose. While the bed frame was drying in the backyard, Jackson patched the 3 holes in the wall and repainted the area. On Monday, he drove to Allentown to buy a new mattress and arranged to have it delivered on Tuesday. He also bought new sheets and pillowcases. By Wednesday, Jackson could see no evidence of what had happened in his bedroom on Halloween night. The new voice started Wednesday night. "Jackson, why did you have to kill me?" Jackson recognized the voice as Margot's, and it made him break out into a cold sweat. "Why couldn't you just let me leave? You cheated me. What did you think I would do?" He shouted, but there was no response. The next day, Margot's sister, Karen, called 3 times asking for her. Each time Jackson said, "She is not home." Karen continued calling daily for the rest of the week, getting the same response from Jackson each time. Each day, the number of times that Margot would speak to Jackson increased. Sometimes she would ask why he killed her. Other times she would beg him to let her go. What bothered him the most was when she would talk about how much in love they were when they got married and how much she missed the man he was back then. On November 15, 1959, Detective Mark Rose from the Brodericksburg Police Department came to the house to see Jackson. He asked Jackson where his wife was, and he told Detective Rose that he didn't know. "Did you know that Margot's sister has filed a missing person report on her? The report says that no one has seen your wife since October 30th. If she has been missing for more than 2 weeks, why didn't you contact the police?" Detective Rose said, "Because she is not missing," Jackson said. "Then where is she?" "I don't know." "Can you explain to me how you can say that you don't know where your wife is, but she is not missing?" Jackson told the detective that he had been in Philadelphia on business October 30th and 31st, took the last train back to Brodericksburg, and caught a cab from the train station and got home around 11 o'clock that night. When he went in the house, his wife was gone, and he found a note from Margot telling him she was leaving him. He got the note from his office and gave it to Detective Rose. Jackson let the detective look around the house, knowing that he would not find any evidence of what happened on Halloween. While Detective Rose was wandering around the house, Margot was talking to Jackson. "Tell him the truth. Tell him how you murdered me. Tell him where I am now, so he can set me free." Jackson had a hard time controlling his emotions during these outbursts from Margot. When Rose was done with his search, which included the cellar and the barn, he told Jackson that he might have more questions for him later. When Detective Rose left, Jackson laughed and said, as if speaking to Margot, "They will never find you." On November 24th, Detective Rose was back. "What do you want now?" Jackson asked. "It seems we have another missing person. His name is Jerry Adler. That name ring any bells?" "No, never heard of him." "Why?" Jackson said, "We believe that Mr. Adler is the man your wife mentioned in her note. So this Adler is the guy she ran off with?" "Well, I don't think they went anywhere but here, and I am going to find them today," Detective Rose said, then handed Jackson a search warrant. "This warrant allows us to search every inch of your property." Detective Rose called out, "We're ready in here." 6 police officers entered the house and headed upstairs while Detective Rose told Jackson that he would have to leave the house during the search. When Jackson walked outside, he saw 4 sheriff deputies heading into the barn and 2 state troopers launching a small boat onto the pond. Jackson sat on his front porch and watched the troopers as they used a large treble hook to drag the bottom of the pond. Jackson had no concerns about what the officers would find in the pond or the barn. His only concern was that one of the officers in the house might get lucky and accidentally find the latch for the tunnel entrance. 2 hours passed before the 6 officers came out of the house to join the sheriff deputies and the troopers. 10 minutes later, 10 more officers arrived, and the 22 officers started walking the property looking for any place 2 bodies may have been buried. After searching the property for more than 4 hours, the officers reported to Detective Rose that they found no sign of the missing couple. As Detective Rose was getting ready to leave, he looked over at Jackson and said, "This isn't over. You are not going to get away with this." Jackson went in the house and poured himself a double shoot of his VO and sat in his office and laughed. "I told you they wouldn't find you, Margot." Jackson poured himself another drink, and as he was about to drink, he heard her. "I am still going to leave you. I'll find another man to take me away." This time Jackson laughed at her. "I told you that you will never leave here," he said, knowing that she wouldn't respond to his words, but she did. "You just wait. One day I will be gone again." October 29, 1964. Jackson arrived at the REORP lab on Thursday morning for his 21st semi-annual visit over the last 11 years. In the beginning, the lab was nothing more than a 4-room building with some medical equipment, but it began to look like a real scientific lab in recent years. The first room now had 10 lab tables, complete with 2 Bunsen burners on each table. The second room was the examination room, where Jackson would spend most of his time over the next 2 days. Off the exam room, there was an office used by the doctors. Jackson had never been allowed in the office. The last room was a bathroom with a shower. The doctors did all of their usual tests Friday afternoon and evening, and then sent Jackson to stay overnight in a hotel 2 blocks from the lab. When Jackson returned Friday morning for his second day of tests, he noticed that several of the tables had containers of chemicals, both liquid and dry. The names of the substances didn't mean anything to Jackson, so he ignored them. Jackson was halfway across the room when he saw something that got his attention. He saw 3 flasks on one of the tables, each suspended over a low flame from a Bunsen burner. Each flask contained a different color liquid, 1 red, 1 blue, and 1 green. The sight of those 3 liquids brought back the memories of entering the supply tent at the atomic test site at Yucca Flat just before the detonation that resulted in the deaths of the 3 soldiers assigned to work with him. These were the 3 chemicals that he fell into that changed his life forever. Jackson worried that the 3 doctors might be planning another experiment that could endanger more soldiers. When Jackson entered the examination room, he started to ask Dr. Baker what they were planning to do with the red, blue, and green liquids. Before Dr. Baker could answer, Dr. Schmidt said, "See Haben, no need to know." Dr. Baker nodded in agreement. "He is right. You don't have a need to know. These experiments are classified. Now, Sergeant, please strip down and put on your gym shorts and leave your shirt off." Dr. Baker had Jackson perform several physical activities while the doctor monitored his heart rate, breathing, and recovery time. He left REORP shortly after 4 o'clock and headed back home. Later that night, while Jackson was reading a James Bond novel, he became aware that he had not heard even 1 word from Margot since he got home. Jackson wondered why she hadn't spoken to him, as she never let him have that much peace before. By 11 o'clock, he realized that he missed hearing her voice. He did not understand why he would miss Margot talking to him, and pondered this when the Virginian spoke to him. "She is gone. She left, and you must find her and bring her back to us." "Gone? How could she be gone?" Jackson asked, but got no response. "That's impossible. Margot is dead, and she is locked in the tunnel." Again, there was no response from the Virginian. "It can't be," he mumbled, then finished his VO and headed off to bed, where he slept poorly. Saturday, October 31st, 1964. Saturday morning, while Jackson was having his coffee, he wondered why he still hadn't heard anything from Margot. She hadn't been silent for so long since the night Jackson put her in the tunnel 5 years earlier. The more he thought about it, the more he started to believe that she was gone. Had her spirit found a way out of the tunnel? Jackson thought about opening the tunnel and check if her body was still there, but decided against doing that. He knew that she could not have left, but why wasn't she talking to him? Jackson began to wonder if he was losing his mind. How could he miss hearing the voice of the woman he loved and killed? That evening, Jackson decided to visit the bar that he and Margot used to frequent in Brodericksburg. He knew it was a crazy idea and that she could not be there, but he had to look anyway. So, at 9 o'clock that night, Jackson walked into the new Delaware Bar and Grill. The name had changed since he had been there with Margot, and he did not recognize anyone there. Jackson went to the bar and ordered a Yingling draft, then turned to face the room and leaned against the bar. It was a half hour later when 4 young women came into the bar and sat at a table on the other side of the room. Jackson didn't see them when they first arrived, and they were already seated when he saw them. He was beginning to think coming out to the bar was a stupid idea and was getting ready to head home when he saw 2 guys approach the girls' table and asked 2 of them to dance. When the girls got up to dance, one of them caught Jackson's attention. She was tall and blonde. She was at least 4 inches taller than the guy with whom she was dancing. Jackson couldn't see her face, but from the back, she looked so much like Margot that his heart began to beat faster. Jackson knew that it could not be Margot, but he had to get a closer look, so he walked over to the dance floor and waited for her to turn so that he could see her face. When he finally got a look at her face, she did not look like Margot. She had blue eyes like Margot, but her mouth and nose were different. The only similarity between this girl and Margot is that they were both tall, blonde, and had blue eyes. He stared at the girl while he tried to decide if he was disappointed or relieved. The next time the tall blonde turned in Jackson's direction, she saw him staring at her, and she smiled at him. When the dance ended, instead of going back to her table, the blonde walked over to him and said, "You see something you like?" "As a matter of fact, I do," Jackson said. "But if you're going to be my new girlfriend, I will need to know your name." "Girlfriend? I don't know about that, but you can buy me a drink," she said. "My name is Tina, and it may interest you to know that I'm married. What should I call you?" Jackson said, "You can call me Michael." "So, where's your husband? If you were my wife, I wouldn't let you come to a place like this without me. My husband is out of town until next Wednesday." "So, are you just out for a Halloween drink with your friends, or are you looking for a bed partner for the night?" "I don't know. I kind of like the way you look and your confidence, but I don't know if I can trust you." Tina said, "Of course you can. Anyway, can anyone else here offer you the chance to make love in a 100-year-old haunted house?" Jackson said, "Haunted house? I doubt it." Jackson told Tina the story of the old Cobain house and how the 4 bounty hunters haunted it. Tina liked the story, and even though she didn't believe in haunted houses or ghosts, Tina agreed to follow him out to the house to spend the night with Jackson. When Tina saw the big house sitting on a hill with no lights on, she felt a chill. For a moment, she wondered if she was making a big mistake by agreeing to come home with Michael. He led Tina into the dark kitchen and turned on the light. While Tina looked around the room, Jackson made her a VO and 7-Up. He made it a double and poured himself a shot. He spent the next 20 minutes showing Tina around the house, ending the tour outside the bedroom. "Are you ready?" Jackson said as he went into the bedroom ahead of Tina. When they entered the room, Jackson began kissing Tina, and as the kissing got more passionate, he opened her blouse, and while kissing between Tina's jugs, Jackson helped Tina remove her skirt. Then he lifted her onto the bed and started removing his clothes. When he was naked, once Jackson had penetrated Tina, he looked at her face, and what he saw shocked him. She looked like Margot. He felt a sudden surge of arousal and anger. Jackson stopped being gentle and started pounding. While Tina was sleeping, Jackson sat up and studied her face. He knew that this woman was not Margot, but she looked like her, which disturbed him enough to make him get up and leave the room. He retreated to his office and sat at the desk, wondering how this woman could have no resemblance to Margot one minute and the next look exactly like her. His reverie was interrupted by the Virginian's voice. "You brought her back. Now you must make certain that she stays." Jackson didn't question what the Virginian said, because he knew what he had to do. He was going to retrieve his pistol from its hiding place in the tunnel and started to get up when he remembered the mess the gun made the last time. So instead, he removed his belt and headed up to the bedroom. When he returned to the bedroom, Tina was still sleeping. Jackson slipped the end of the belt through the buckle to form a loop and then lifted Tina so he could get the loop around her neck. He pulled the loop tight, cutting off Tina's airways. Tina woke in a panic and struggled to get free, but she was no match for Jackson's strength, and after just a couple of minutes, she gave up the fight. He checked the pulse in her neck, and not finding one, he carried her naked body down to the tunnel and placed her next to Margot's remains. After sealing up the tunnel, Jackson drove Tina's car down to Philadelphia and parked it on Broad Street and left the keys in the ignition. When Jackson was home again and getting ready for bed, the Virginian whispered, "You must remain vigilant." October 29, 1987. Finally, at 2 o'clock on Thursday, after completing his 63rd physical at RURP, Dr. Baker told Jackson to shower and return to the examination room because the doctor wanted to talk to him. When he returned to the examination room with his shoes in his hand, Dr. Baker was already waiting for him. "Sergeant, we need you to return next week so that Dr. Schmidt can get a sample of your lung tissue and a small sample from your liver." "How's he going to do that?" "It'll have to be done surgically." "No, I am not letting that Nazi operate on me," Jackson said. "Sergeant, this is part of the agreement you made," Dr. Baker said. "Then I quit," Jackson said. Dr. Baker shook his head. "You will not be allowed to quit. There are powerful people involved, and they will not let you walk away. Do you understand?" Jackson understood. It was a threat, and it angered him. He would have to do something to end this nightmare. Jackson nodded his head, indicating that he understood the threat. "Good. I will contact you to let you know when to be here." Jackson sat down to put his shoes on, and Dr. Baker retreated into the office. But before the door closed, Jackson saw that Schmidt and Bradshaw were in the office waiting. He hated the idea that these old men, all the three of them were at least 75 years old, were in control of his life. With shoes on, Jackson left the examination room and walked into the lab. He stopped and saw that the doctors were cooking up a batch of red, blue, and green chemicals again. He looked at the low flames from the Bunsen burners under the flasks and wondered what would happen if he turned the burners up. Would it destroy their experiments? He realized destroying the chemicals would not stop them. It would only delay them. Then another idea came to him. Jackson went over to the red flask and turned the gas down until the flame barely showed above the top of the burner. Then he turned off the gas under the blue and green flasks, and when the flame went out, he turned the gas back on full. On his way out of the lab, he opened the gas valves for several more Bunsen burners. Jackson left the building and walked quickly down to the bus stop to wait for the bus to take him to the train station. The bus arrived 5 minutes later. He had just taken his seat and looked out the window toward the RURP lab as the bus began to move. Suddenly, the whole front wall of the lab blew out, followed by a ball of fire. The explosion shook the bus violently, and many of the passengers began screaming and yelling, but not Jackson. He sat quietly with a smile on his lips. He continued to watch as the roof collapsed and the fire grew in intensity. The bus stayed at the scene until a police officer told the driver to leave. As the bus pulled away, Jackson looked back at the remains of RURP and smiled. He got home a little after 6 o'clock Thursday evening. He felt good about what he did to the lab, but he wanted to know what happened to the doctors. Jackson poured a double VO and headed in to watch the evening news on the CBS affiliate in Philadelphia. The story was near the end of the broadcast. The headline from the news anchor was, "Explosion in a Medical Laboratory Kills 3. Fire Marshal Rules the Explosion an Accident." When Jackson heard that, he took his drink down in one swallow and then refilled his glass. He didn't bother to listen to the rest of the story. He heard what he needed to hear. He was free. October 31st, 1987. The fourth time Margot escaped. It took Jackson almost 5 months to find her. Margot had stopped speaking to him in May, but he wasn't sure she was gone until the middle of June when the Virginian told him that she was gone. Jackson spotted her the first week of October in a place called Raffles in Bethlehem. Raffles had live music on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday nights and drew a good crowd. Her name was Jennifer, and she came to Raffles every Saturday night because her husband worked Saturday nights and would not be home until Sunday afternoon. Jennifer had danced with him several times on the 3 previous Saturday nights and had hinted to Jackson that she hoped that he would come to Raffles on Halloween. That is when he was sure that he had found Margot. While dancing with Jennifer on Halloween night, Jackson asked her if she would spend the night with him. "Why would I want to do that?" Jennifer asked. When will you get another chance to spend Halloween night in a haunted house that is over 100 years old and have the greatest sex of your life? Jennifer smiled at him and asked, "Where is this haunted house, and how do you know about it?" "It's my house," Jackson said, and then told her the story about the dead bounty hunters that haunted the house. "Sounds like fun. Let's go." Jackson knew she would go with him. He knew that Margot wanted to come home, just like she did the previous 3 times he had to find and bring her home. Jackson believed that when Margot's spirit escaped the tunnel, she would find a woman that looked like her when she was alive to possess to make it easier for Jackson to find her. Then she would go dancing and have fun while waiting for him to come to get her. And, just like all of her other adventures, this one ended the same way. Jackson took Jennifer home, but made love to Margot. Afterward, Jackson returned Margot to her resting place in the tunnel. Saturday, October 31st, 1998. Margot had been gone this time for only 5 days when Jackson found her. Jackson met Jane Markle the night before Halloween in a bar in Bethlehem. After drinking and dancing with her most of the night, he invited her to spend Halloween in his haunted house. He knew that she would not say no, because Margot wanted to come home. That Saturday night, Jane drove to Brodericksburg and went to Jackson's house where he had sex with her body, but it was Margot that he was making love to in his mind. Then, as always, he returned Margot to the tunnel. Tuesday, December 15th, 1998. Brian Hobbs was starting his 3rd week as a detective in the Brodericksburg Police Department. Previously, Detective Hobbs had been a detective on the Baltimore Police Force, but decided that he would prefer to work for his hometown police department. When Brian came into the station that Tuesday morning, Chief Paziak called him into his office. "Detective, I need you to work this missing person investigation. The MP's name is Mrs. Jane Markle. Mrs. Markle is a 26-year-old housewife reported missing by her husband in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She is 6 feet tall, weighs 145 pounds, and has blonde hair and blue eyes. It turns out that Mrs. Markle had told a friend that she was going to drive down to Brodericksburg to celebrate Halloween in a haunted house with a man she had met. She hasn't been seen since October 30th. She's been missing for more than a month. Why are we just getting this now?" Hobbs asked. "Bethlehem PD has been investigating this and just interviewed one of Mrs. Markle's friends who told them of Mrs. Markle's plans to come to Brodericksburg. If she hasn't turned up by now, this probably isn't going to end well, but see what you can find out." Detective Hobbs interviewed John Markle, the husband. Mr. Markle said that he had been out of town on business and didn't return until Tuesday, November 3rd. He told Hobbs that his wife wasn't home and her car was gone. Mr. Markle said that he called some of her friends, and they told him that they had not seen Jane since Friday, the 30th. Detective Hobbs interviewed the friend that told the Bethlehem police that Mrs. Markle was going to Brodericksburg. The friend told him that no one told Mr. Markle about the wife's plan to go to Brodericksburg with a friend because they knew it was a man and didn't want to tell Mr. Markle that his wife was cheating on him. Detective Hobbs worked the case for 3 months without a break. Detective Hobbs found no evidence that Mrs. Markle had been in Brodericksburg, nor could he find information about a haunted house being set up for Halloween anywhere in Brodericksburg. A bolo for her car turned up nothing. A month later, Hobbs got a call from Bethlehem PD informing him that Mrs. Markle's car was found abandoned in Philadelphia, and the case got moved into the unsolved case file. Saturday, October 31st, 2015. Jackson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, getting ready for his date with Tracy Johnson. He just wondered how ready Tracy Johnson would be for her last night out. In recent years, he seemed to be spending more time looking at his reflection. The accident at Yucca Flat was 62 years ago, but Jackson looks exactly the same as he did when he was still Michael Bliss. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever grow old. "I'm going to live forever," Jackson said out loud and laughed. This time Margot left in September, but instead of making Jackson look for her, she came to him. In reading, looking at a Mustang he was thinking of buying, Jackson heard someone speaking to him. "What did you say?" Jackson said as he turned to see who was talking. She was tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. "I was asking you if you were going to buy this car," she said. Jackson saw her wedding ring and said, "I was thinking about it, Mrs. Johnson, Tracy Johnson." "Nice to meet you, Tracy. I am Michael. Can I ask you why you care if I buy this car?" "Oh, I don't care. I just think you would look good in it. If I buy it, will you go for a ride with me? Buy the car and then ask me. Jackson bought the Mustang, and Tracy Johnson went for a ride with him. When he brought he back to the car dealership, he asked Tracy to go out with him on Halloween. I'm a married woman. It wouldn't be proper for me to go on a date with you. Oh, come on. You know you want to. Just say yes, and I promise you a night you won't forget. Tracy leaned against Jackson and kissed him on the cheek and said, I will be in Allentown at the Marriott with some friends on Halloween. Why don't you meet me there? Jackson walked into the Marriott at 10 o'clock on Halloween, found Tracy in the bar, and talked her into following him home. He showed Tracy around the house and even told her about the hidden tunnel and the dead bounty hunters inside. Can I see the tunnel? Tracy asked. Sure, after I show you my bedroom, Jackson said. He wasn't worried about telling Tracy about the tunnel because that is where she would be spending eternity. Jackson had stopped feeling guilty about what he was doing after the third time. He blamed Margot for making him kill these women. If she would just stay in the tunnel where she belonged, he would not have to find her and bring her back. He took Tracy to the bedroom and made slow, passionate love to her, and then strangled her.